The history of women in the Old Testament is marked by challenges and oppression that are often invisible to modern eyes. Among these women, the concubines played a unique and often misunderstood role. They lived within the palace, but their lives were silent, almost erased from the narrative. In the Old Testament, the lives of women were marked by challenges and many sacrifices, especially when we talk about the concubines. They did not have the right to be called wives and were often treated as property. Even so, they lived in palaces, sharing the bed with kings and patriarchs, but could not enjoy the same privileges as legitimate wives. A concubine was a woman who, even though she lived in a man's house, did not receive the rights of a wife. She was there to fulfill a very specific function, to bear children, ensuring the continuation of the man's lineage. But what many don't know is that this system did not exist by choice of the women, but by imposition. In the ancient East, concubines did not have the legal protection that wives received, and they did not have a formal contract guaranteeing their rights. They were at the mercy of men, without voice or rights, a portrait of a very cruel, patriarchal society. The term used for concubine in the scriptures is pilegesh, and it's important to know that this was not a marginal or secondary position, but one with well-established rules. A concubine was not just a lover. She had responsibilities and a role in the family and lineage context. However, what distinguished them from wives was the lack of legal protection. They were property of their masters, without the rights that wives had, such as support, clothing, and even potential compensation if the man dismissed them. Imagine, with no future, no guarantees, and no name to be remembered. This scenario of neglect and invisibility of concubines is reflected in the stories in the Bible, like that of Hagar. Hagar was an Egyptian servant given by Sarah, Abraham's wife, to bear an heir, since Sarah could not have children. Hagar had no choice. She was not consulted. She was a pawn in a plan that did not include her opinion or desire. And when Hagar became pregnant, Sarah, who had initially proposed this idea, began to look at Hagar with contempt, which caused a lot of pain and suffering for Hagar. Due to the mistreatment, Hagar fled to the desert alone, with a child in her womb and without any support. However, the most surprising part of this story is the moment when Hagar, in the desert, receives a visit from an angel. Hagar was alone, without hope, without a clear future. But God found her. The angel spoke to her, gave her a promise, and comforted her, saying that her son Ishmael would be the father of a great nation. Hagar then gave God a name that had never been given before, El Roi, which means, "You are the God who sees me." Imagine a woman despised by society, with no value at all, being noticed by God. This is a powerful lesson that even in times of abandonment and suffering, God sees us and loves us. The example of Hagar is powerful, but it's not the only one. The Bible shows us how the system of concubinage deeply influenced the lives of these women. They weren't just secondary women, but essential pieces within a power system that served to maintain the order and lineage of powerful men. In the case of Jacob, for example, his wives, Rachel and Leah, used their servants Bilhah and Zilpah as concubines to bear children, as Rachel was barren. This shows how concubines were seen merely as reproductive tools, without a voice or choice. These women bore sons who became leaders of the tribes of Israel, but they never had an active role in decisions or control over their own lives. The cycle of power and abuse repeats in other stories, such as that of David. King David had many wives and concubines. His story is filled with triumphs, but also with tragedies involving his concubines. When Absalom, his son, rebelled against him, he took his father's concubines as an act of public humiliation. In 2 Samuel 16, we see that he did this to mark his ascension to power, showing the people that the old reign had fallen. David's concubines were not just objects of desire, but symbols of political power. They were used to declare a shift in loyalty and power in Israel, without being consulted or even respected in their humanity. When Absalom took over Jerusalem, David's concubines were left behind in an empty palace without protection, without purpose, and without a future. But the cruelest part is that even after David's victory over Absalom, he did not restore the dignity of his concubines. In 2 Samuel 20, he placed them in a house under surveillance, providing for them, but never again laying with them. They were isolated, living as widows, having committed no crime, but paying for the political choices of David and Absalom. These women never received the recognition they deserved, being erased from history and forgotten. This reality of abuse and dehumanization extended not only to the upper echelons of society, but also to common men. In the book of Judges, we see that Gideon, the leader of Israel, had many women and with them a series of children. One of his sons, Abimelech, was born to a concubine. After Gideon's death, Abimelech murdered his 69 half-brothers to seize power. This tragedy reveals how the practice of having concubines created fierce competition among the children, and how the system left no space for true orderly succession, resulting in violence and death. Once again, the concubines had no control over their destiny, nor over the future of their children. But the story of the concubines in the Old Testament is not just a story of violence and abuse. There are moments of great humanity where, even amid suffering, the concubines have their voices and dignity recognized, like the case of Rizpah. After the death of her sons, Rizpah, a concubine of Saul, spent months by their bodies, protecting them from birds and wild animals. Her vigil, marked by pain and resistance, was so powerful that it reached the ears of King David, who, moved by Rizpah's act, ordered that the bodies be buried with dignity. This act of silent resistance and courage by a woman with no legal status was able to change the course of a king. Rizpah's story is not the only one that reveals the strength of concubines. Even in situations of invisibility, they showed resistance and courage. Many concubines lived in a routine of constant work, taking care of domestic chores and always being available to the men. They were not just women at disposal, but were treated as if they were part of the necessary structure to ensure the continuity of families and clans. They bore children, served their masters, and if they did not produce offspring, they became irrelevant. With every new child they bore, they gained a little more security, but still, they were always in the background. The rivalry between the children of wives and concubines was a constant in the patriarchal history. This created conflicts like the case of Ishmael and Isaac, the sons of Abraham. Although Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn, he was expelled along with his mother, Hagar, due to the pressure from Sarah, the legitimate wife. This separation created a division that later would cause a great conflict between the descendants of Isaac, the Israelites, and the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs. The story of Ishmael teaches us that, despite being the legitimate son of Abraham, he was treated unfairly simply because he was born of a concubine. The Old Testament not only records these conflicts, but also presents concubinage as a practice of power, where the number of concubines was a measure of a man's status. Solomon, the son of David, took this to the extreme, accumulating 700 wives and 300 concubines. This number is not just an impressive statistic, but it reflects Solomon's power and wealth. The fact that he had so many women is a sign of his influence, but it also reveals the superficiality and degradation of a system that saw women as objects to satisfy the ego and desires of powerful men. Solomon, despite his wisdom, did not follow the advice given in the scriptures to not multiply wives, which ended up being one of the reasons that led to the division of the kingdom. And even with all the wealth and wisdom of Solomon, The concubines had no real value within his reign. They were treated as luxury objects, used to strengthen political alliances, but with no genuine consideration for their lives or feelings. The biblical text warns us about the consequences of this type of social structure. The biblical narrative does not celebrate this accumulation of women. On the contrary, it presents it as a deviation from divine principles. Solomon, in his pursuit of power and status, disregarded the warning from the scriptures, and this resulted in the division of Israel, a clear sign that the system of concubinage was not a practice blessed by God. What the Bible teaches us in documenting the stories of the concubines is not only about the abuses committed against them, but also about God's vision for the dignity of women. Although the system of concubinage existed for many centuries, God never stopped seeing and valuing these women. Hagar, Rizpah, and other concubines who appear in the scriptures received in some way divine recognition. Even though they were devalued by society, they were seen and loved by God. And this reminds us that even in times of suffering and injustice, God was always present, offering hope and restoring the dignity of those whom society devalued. Throughout the Old Testament, the concubines appear as forgotten women, but also as central figures who silently supported the power and authority structures of men. Although their stories are often erased, the truth is that they played a crucial role in the history of Israel. The women who occupied this space, even though treated unjustly, carried in their bodies the weight of political, familial, and even spiritual decisions. The stories of these women, like Hagar and Rizpah, teach us that, even in the most difficult situations, there is always space for divine intervention. Furthermore, the Bible shows us that despite how cruel the system of concubinage was, God never abandoned these women. Jesus himself, throughout his life and ministry, showed deep concern for the marginalized and devalued women in society. If we look closely at the biblical stories, we will realize that God never let the concubines, despite their suffering, be completely invisible. Each of them, even being forgotten by men, was noticed by God and had her role in the history of salvation. The message that the Bible conveys to us by recording these stories so clearly is that human dignity is something that God recognizes, even when society fails to do so. The concubines were treated as property, with no value or rights, but in God's eyes, they were never forgotten. They had no name in history, but God saw them, knew them, and blessed them. This reminds us that even when we feel invisible or devalued, God sees us and is always ready to lift us up. The story of Solomon, with his hundreds of wives and concubines, also serves as a warning. Although he was a wise king, his practice of accumulating women as symbols of power led to the division of the kingdom and the decline of his nation. The multiplication of women did not bring happiness or prosperity to Solomon. In fact, it was a clear sign that focusing on power and status rather than following divine principles leads to destruction. This lesson is important for all of us, as it teaches us that even if we have success or status, it should not come at the cost of the values that God teaches us. In the end, when we look at the Old Testament and reflect on the lives of the concubines, we realize that although they lived in an inhumane and abusive system, God never abandoned them. Each of these women who lived in a context of pain and marginalization played an important role in biblical history. God revealed himself to them, made promises to them, and used them to carry out his plans. Thus, the story of the concubines is not just a story of oppression, but also of resistance, faith, and the continued divine intervention in the lives of those whom society tends to forget. If you were moved by this story and want to learn more about the powerful lessons the Bible has to teach us, subscribe to the channel Discípulos de Biblia. Here, together, we will dive deeper into the Word of God and better understand the stories that shaped our faith. Like, share with your friends and help us spread this message of hope, faith, and reflection. May God bless your life and see you in the next video.